thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I can only say now you're all going to be really disappointed. So I want to talk about the question, why is death bad for you? But it's important to say just at the outset that I'm going to be examining that question against a certain assumption, namely the assumption that your death will mean the end of your existence, that you won't survive your death. Now, I know that's a controversial assumption, and in other work, I've laid out some of the reasons why you should, in fact, believe that death is the end. But I'm not going to try to defend that thought here. And so for those of you who don't already agree, you can take what I'm about to say as a kind of conditional, if we were to agree that death was the end, or that the death of your body was the end of your existence, what would follow about what we should say or could say about why death is bad? I suppose the thought that if death is the end, if death is the end, that death is bad for you is a familiar thought, and indeed it's precisely that thought, I suppose, that drives many people into the belief, or at least the hope, that death might not be the end, precisely so as to avoid that bad. So anyway, that's the assumption I'm going to be exploring. And on the face of it, somewhat surprisingly, it becomes puzzling, and we'll explore that puzzle over the course of today's talk. It's puzzling as to how it could be that death is bad for you if it's the end. Because after all, if it really is the end, that means that, well, when you die, you won't exist. In which case, how could anything be bad for you? You won't even exist. And of course, it's nothing special about badness. Nothing could be good for you. Nothing could be bad for you. If you don't exist, nothing can be much of anything for you, right? And so there's something puzzling about the mere thought that death could be bad for you on the, as I say, the metaphysical assumption I'll be helping myself to, that it really is the end. Now, I suppose many people, in response to this thought that death is the end and it can't be bad for me, I won't be around, try to deal with it by saying, look, the real reason death is problematic isn't for the person who dies, it's problematic for the people who survive. The loss of your wife means you don't have your wife around. The loss of your friendship means you can't interact with your friend in the way that gives depth and richness and value to your life. And so death is bad for the survivors, not really for the person who dies. That's a common enough thought. Now, I don't in any way want to dismiss the badness involved in separation from loved ones, but I do think it's reasonable to conclude that it's not the primary or essential or the central bad about what's bad about death. And to bring that out, let me quickly sketch two different stories. In story number one, your best friend, let's suppose, is about to go off on the spaceship to explore distant galaxies, some other planetary space system, right? And so we've conquered the usual problems. They're going to be able to get to some other star system. And eventually they'll come back. By the time they come back, 100 Earth years will have passed. But because of relativistic effects, your friend will only have aged 10 years. But you'll long since be dead. To make it worse, 25 minutes after the ship takes off, all radio contact will be lost. And so you'll never, ever be able to communicate with your friend again. And so here we have that kind of separation that death involves. You can't communicate with your friend. You can't share your life stories. You can't get her advice and so forth and so on. That's story number one. That's bad. Story number two, just like story number one, the ship takes off, except 30 minutes after it takes off, horribly enough, there's a tremendous explosion on the ship. The ship's completely destroyed. Everybody's killed instantaneously. Now, I take it that you've got the thought, I certainly have the thought, I hope you have the thought, that story number two is worse than story number one. But the separation is the same in both of those cases. So whatever it is that makes story number two worse, which obviously has to do with the death of your friend, can't be explained, the badness of her death can't be explained simply in terms of the separation that's involved, because we already had that in story number one. The extra badness, intuitively, maybe even just obviously, has to do with the special bad that's now been suffered by your friend in dying. So that's the bad I want to think about. Not to deny that, of course, it's bad to lose people, but that there's a special central badness about death, namely the bad that's involved for the person who's dying. And I want to understand, how that could be. Again, to focus the question, we want to put aside some other things that might be mistaken or confused with it. Obviously enough, the process of dying could be a bad one. Suppose that I, 20 years from now, get eaten alive by Bengali tigers. That would no doubt be a very, very unpleasant way to die. And so that would be bad. On the other hand, many people die in their sleep, and so the process of dying need not be a painful or unpleasant or a bad one. So I want to put that aside as well, because that, I don't think is the central way in which death is bad. And of course, it's also the case that for most of us that the fact that we are going to die fills us now. The prospect of our death, for many of us, is a dreadful one and an unpleasant one to contemplate. And I don't want to deny that either, although I think sometimes people who talk about being afraid of death aren't necessarily responding in the most appropriate fashion. But even if we put that concern aside, I think to whatever extent concern, anxiety, dread, in anticipation of death makes sense, it piggybacks on the logically prior thought that being dead is itself bad for me. I mean, after all, suppose I said to you, tomorrow something incredibly fantastic is going to happen. And you say, oh, yeah, I believe that. And I got to tell you, I'm just so dreading it. Well, that wouldn't make any sense. To dread something in the future presupposes that that future thing is itself going to be bad. If the future thing's not bad, the dread now doesn't make sense. And so again, we've got to focus on not the process of dying, not the anticipation of dying, but the being dead. Again, most of us, I suppose, think that being dead is bad for us. The fact that I will be dead is bad for me, but how can it be? Well, what is it that's the essential aspect about being dead? And I've suggested, given the metaphysical assumption that I'm helping myself to, the central thought is that when you're dead, you don't exist. And so we might ask, well, all right, but how could non-existence be bad for me? I've already indicated there's something slightly puzzling about that, and the puzzle is going to return in a couple of different forms over the course of the rest of the talk. But still, I think we can make some progress by thinking about different ways things can be bad for you. And what I want to do is to distinguish 3 different ways that things can be bad for you. So some things are bad in and of themselves, in their own right. We try to avoid them, as it were, for their own sake. Those are things we're trying to get out of our life. I suppose the paradigmatic instance of this is something like pain. Right? Pain is something that's bad in and of itself. In philosophers' jargon, we say that pain is intrinsically bad. I mean, there are better, worse and less bad pains. Migraines are worse than the pain of having a paper cut or what have you. But they're all intrinsically bad. In their own right, they're things worth avoiding. That's one way things can be bad. A second way that things can be bad involves things that are not necessarily intrinsically bad, but they lead to things that are intrinsically bad. So take something like unemployment. It's not plausible, I think, to suggest that being unemployed is bad in and of itself. There's nothing objectionable about being unemployed per se. But being unemployed leads to the loss of income. The loss of income leads to the loss of food, the inability to purchase food. The loss of food leads to the reduction in the ability to get the pleasure from eating ice cream. It also leads to hunger, and hunger is painful. So there's an example of something that's not intrinsically bad. Unemployment's not intrinsically bad, but it's instrumentally bad. So that's 2, I think, fairly familiar ways in which things can be bad. There's, in fact, I think, a third way that things can be bad that it's more easy to overlook, but I think is going to be important for thinking about the badness of death, especially important. And that's the way in which something could be bad when you compare it to what the alternatives could have been. Suppose that you're home watching Survivor 27 on television for 30 minutes, and it's a perfectly pleasant way to spend the half hour, the hour, whatever it might be. There need not be anything intrinsically bad about the hour spent watching television. It's certainly not painful, and it doesn't have to involve any other intrinsic bads. And we can help ourselves to the assumption that watching that hour of television is not instrumentally bad either. It doesn't lead your brain to rot, let's suppose, as long as you don't watch too much of it, right? So it's not instrumentally bad, it's not intrinsically bad, but still, suppose that you've forgotten that there's this really great party you could have been going to while you're sitting home watching television. And so in comparison to the fact that you're not having this great party experience, the time spent watching the television is, comparatively speaking, bad. It's a comparative bad. Here's a second example. Suppose I hold up two envelopes and say, pick one. And so you open up the envelope, and inside is $10. And you say, whoa, look at that, $10. Now, $10 is not intrinsically good for you. There's nothing, it's just a piece of paper, right? But on the other hand, it's instrumentally good. It can buy you a couple of slices of pizza or a beer or an ice cream cone or what have you. So the $10 is not intrinsically bad. It's not instrumentally bad. But suppose that the other envelope had $1,000 in it. Then you might say, oh, kind of too bad for you that you picked the envelope that had only the $10 in it, because this is an example of a comparative bad. All right, so if we think about the badness of death and ask ourselves, how could it be that non-existence is bad for me? So death is bad because when I'm dead I won't exist. How can non-existence be bad for me? Well, non-existence isn't a plausible candidate for something that's intrinsically bad. If when I'm dead I really won't exist, it certainly is not going to involve painful experiences, right? Or other intrinsic bads plausibly won't be there when you don't exist. Nor does non-existence lead to anything else that might be intrinsically bad, so it's not instrumentally bad. But plausibly, arguably, non-existence is a comparative bad. Comparative bads are bad for you precisely because when you've got them, you're deprived of the alternative which would have been better for you. And so maybe what's bad about death is the fact that when you're dead, you don't have some alternative thing that would have been good. Death is bad because of what it deprives you of. Well, what does death deprive us of? It deprives us of life. And in particular, then, it deprives us of the good things in life. And so the proposal is that the reason death is bad, or the way death is bad, or to put it somewhat more guardedly, the central way in which death is bad, is precisely as a comparative bad. It deprives you, by virtue of being dead, by virtue of not existing, you are deprived of the good things in life that you would have been getting if only you weren't dead. Famously, W.C. Fields wanted to have his tombstone read, "I'd rather be in Philadelphia." And that's, I think, the same idea at stake, that there are things you could have been doing, right? I think this is also meant to be somewhat put down of Philadelphia, but even Philadelphia has some good things in life, and if only you were not dead, you could be having them. So this account of the badness of death is known as the deprivation account. The central way in which death is bad for you is by virtue of your being deprived of the good things in life. And to put the point somewhat more guardedly, we might say death is bad for you when it's bad for you insofar as if only you were alive, you would be getting good things in life, or you'd be getting a chunk of life that's on balance more good than bad. So as I say, that's known as the deprivation account. And I think that the deprivation account is pointing in the right direction. Indeed, I think it actually is the correct account of the central way in which death is bad. Sadly, however, it's not all smooth sailing. There are some puzzles still remaining about accepting or embracing the deprivation account. And what I want to do now is work through a number of those puzzles. In fact, that's all I'm going to be doing for the rest of the time that we've got. So here's one puzzle. There are various puzzles that have been raised about the deprivation account, and some people offer these puzzles as objections. They say, look, the deprivation account at first glance seems pretty reasonable, but if you take it seriously, it has the following implications. These implications are not acceptable, and so we have to reject the deprivation account. We might, in fact, be led to the bold conclusion that death isn't really bad for us after all, despite the fact that that's what we were naturally inclined to think. All right, so I want to mention a couple of such puzzles. Here's the first. The first puzzle or the first objection starts with a claim about metaphysics, with a claim about facts. And the claim is that facts can be dated. That is, when some purported fact is a fact, we can talk about when it happened or when it was true. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. Right now I'm talking to you, right? So here's a fact. Shelley Kagan is talking about the badness of death at 3:22 on March 1st, 2013. All right. So there's a fact. Shelley Kagan is talking about the badness of death. Now, when was Shelley Kagan talking about the badness of death? We can date that. We can say, indeed, I just put the date out. I said it explicitly. That was happening at 3:22 on March 1st, 2013. Facts can be dated. Here's another example. Thomas Jefferson was the President of the United States. Well, when was Thomas Jefferson the President of the United States? Well, he was President between March 4th, 1801 and March 4th, 1809, if I remember correctly. So there's a fact. Jefferson was President of the United States, and it can be dated. Facts can be dated. We can say, roughly speaking, when they were true, when they held, when they obtained. Now, armed with that thought, we might ask, well, when is death bad for me? If it's true that death is bad for me, if it's a fact that death is bad for me, then given our metaphysical claim that facts can be dated, we have to ask, when is it true that death is bad for you? When is it bad for you? Well, it's not bad for me now. I'm not dead now. It's not a very plausible suggestion that death is bad for me now. Is it bad for me when I'm dead? That's hard to believe. We're back to this thought that, look, when you're dead, you don't exist. How can things be bad for you when you don't even exist? So if death can't be bad for me now, and death can't be bad for me when I'm dead, then there is no date at which death is bad for me, in which case the purported badness of death can't be dated. But if all genuine facts can be dated, it would follow that death isn't really bad for me. That would be surprising, but that seems to be the implication of the argument. Now, actually, in a second, just a couple seconds, I'm going to read to you a passage from Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher. This is a passage which has intrigued philosophers, well, for more than 2,000 years. It's some kind of argument to the effect that death isn't really bad for you. That's what Epicurus thought. Many people think he's saying something interesting, but as you'll see in a second when I read it to you, it's not altogether transparent what's bugging Epicurus. But it's possible that what he's talking about is this argument about dating the badness of death that I just gave. Anyway, let me read the passage to you. It's only a couple of sentences. So death, this is Epicurus, so death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us. But when death comes, then we do not exist. It does not then concern either the living or the dead, since for the former it is not, and the latter are no more. Now, as I hope you can see, it's not obvious what Epicurus has on his mind, but at least it's not. It's a possible interpretation that he's offering the dating objection. All facts have to be datable. Death isn't bad for the living. Obviously, they're not dead. The only other possibility for dating it would be when they're dead, but the dead are no more. They don't exist. Death can't be bad for them then. So we can't date the badness of death. And then maybe Epicurus' thought is all facts have to be dated. So death, turns out, really isn't bad for us after all. Now, whether or not that's Epicurus' argument, let's ask ourselves, well, is there a response to it? I mean, one possible response, of course, is to accept the argument. And Epicurus, at least if this is Epicurus' argument, did accept that conclusion. And some philosophers have gone that way. I'm inclined to think, no, death is bad for us, so we've got to find some way to resist the argument. And there's, on the face of it, only two ways out. After all, the claim was, one, all genuine facts can be dated, and two, the badness of death can't be dated, so the badness of death is not a genuine fact. Death isn't bad for you. So if you're going to resist the argument, you're either going to have to give up the metaphysical claim that all facts can be dated, or you're going to have to come up with some answer, here's why and when, here's when death is bad for you. Let's try the first way first. To go the first way is to give up the metaphysical claim that all facts can be dated. Now, obviously, lots of facts can be dated. I gave two examples, a minute or two ago. But maybe there are some facts that can't be dated. If there are some facts that can't be dated, maybe here's another one. Death is bad for me. It's a fact, but it can't be dated. Well, let's take a look. Here, let's try if we can see if we can find a less controversial example. So suppose that on Monday, I shoot Frank. But I don't hit him in the heart. He's bleeding, but he's bleeding slowly. He's still alive on Monday. On Tuesday, Frank's still alive, but I die of a heart attack. I get my comeuppance. Frank's still alive, though. On Wednesday, Frank has finally lost enough blood that he dies. Okay? Monday, I shoot him. Tuesday, I die. Wednesday, he dies. Now, I assume we are all on board in saying, I've killed Frank. Good. That's a fact. I killed Frank. When did I kill him? Did I kill him on Monday? That doesn't seem very promising. Frank's still alive on Monday. How can I have killed him on Monday while he's alive? Did I kill him on Tuesday? That doesn't seem very promising either. Frank's still alive on Tuesday. Did I kill him on Wednesday? Well, that's more promising. At least Frank's dead now. But wait a minute. I died on Tuesday. How could I possibly have killed Frank on Wednesday if I died on Tuesday? So it looks as though I didn't kill him on Monday, I didn't kill him on Tuesday, I didn't kill him on Wednesday. I certainly didn't kill him on Sunday before I shot him. I suppose I didn't kill him, a year after he dies, right? So no candidate here about when did I kill him? What's the date for how we can date that fact? None of the answers there seem especially attractive, seem especially appealing. Well, maybe we should conclude, therefore, not all facts can be dated. Here's an example. It's a fact that I killed him. It's not even mysterious. Why is it a fact? It's a fact because I shot him and he died from blood loss coming from the wound. But when did I kill him? Maybe we just can't date it. In which case, maybe there really are some facts that can't be dated. In which case, maybe the badness of death is one more such fact. Right? That's one possibility. Another possibility, actually, and of course, some of you may want that way out, though some of you may be intrigued by this example and will go home and will think about, well, isn't this the right time to date it? Isn't this the right way to date killings? And then you'd have to work your way through other examples like this. Let me just throw off yet another one. Lincoln was taller than Napoleon. When? So maybe you can work your way through all the puzzle cases and say, yes, by golly, all facts can be dated, in which case that way out's not going to be available to you. You're going to have to try to come up, if you are going to insist that death really is bad, you're going to have to come up with some way to date the badness of death. So let's try that approach. Well, as I say, I find it very, very hard to believe that death is bad for me now while I'm still not dead. So as far as I'm concerned, though, if we're going to go that way, the way to go is to say death is bad for me when I'm dead. Is that a plausible thing to say, or is that an implausible thing to say? At first glance, it seems implausible, but maybe at second glance, it's not so implausible. Think again about headaches are bad for you. When are headaches bad for you? Well, when the bad thing is happening to it, when the headache is happening. That's when the headache is bad for you. Well, if the deprivation account is right, and the badness of death consists in that deprivation, the lack of, the not having of the good things in life, if that's the central badness of death, then maybe it's plausible to say that death is bad for you when that bad is occurring. When is that bad occurring? It's occurring when you are deprived. When are you deprived? You're deprived when you are dead. So when is death bad for you? It's bad for you precisely when you're dead. So maybe we really could date it after all. So maybe we can answer the dating objection. But if we say that, then we're just brought back yet again to the worry, all right, death is bad for me when I don't exist, but how can it be bad for me when I don't exist? After all, I don't exist then. If I don't exist, there's no me there to have properties. How can I have the property of having something bad for me occurring? That's pretty puzzling. And it's not clear we've dealt with that problem yet. So consider the following objection. We say, for something to be bad for you, you've got to exist. When you're dead, you don't exist. So death can't be bad for you. Maybe that's what was bugging Epicurus. I mean, hear the passage again. So death, the most terrifying of ills, is nothing to us, since so long as we exist, death is not with us. But when death comes, then we do not exist. It does not then concern either the living or the dead, since for the former it is not, and the latter are no more. Again, the passage isn't transparent, but maybe he's got something like this existence argument in mind. For bad things, for something to be bad for you, or for that matter, for it to be good for you, you've got to exist. Call that the existence requirement. Since we're not going to be worried about the goodness of stuff, we're focusing on the badness of death, we can just look at it in its bad version. For something to be bad for you, you've got to exist. That's the existence requirement. When you're dead, you don't exist. So death can't be bad for you. Or being dead can't be bad for you. Well, we're just assuming, I'm just said this at the outset, we're just assuming that death really is the end. So the second premise of that argument is granted, that when you're dead, you don't exist. So the argument looks as though it's going to go through as long as we grant the existence requirement. The first premise, the claim that for something to be bad for you, you've got to exist, the existence requirement. So should we grant the existence requirement? Now you might think, it would be reasonable to think that we've already seen that we should reject the existence requirement. After all, look, it's plausible to think that for something to be intrinsically bad for you, you've got to exist. I can't have a headache when I don't exist. It's plausible to think that for something to be instrumentally bad for you, you've got to exist. If this bad thing is going to lead to bad stuff, intrinsically bad stuff, you're going to have to exist to receive the intrinsically bad stuff. So the existence requirement seems right for intrinsic bads and for instrumental bads, but maybe it's not right for comparative bads, for deprivation bads. Now, of course, in many, many cases of deprivation bads, I do exist when the comparative bad of the deprivation is taking place. I mean, when I was watching television, or you were watching television in the example, instead of going to the party, you're having the comparative bad of not being at the party. You were existing while you watched TV. When you opened the $10 envelope with the $10 in it, and you had the comparative bad of not having won the 1,000, you were existing when you had the $10. So many, many cases of deprivation involve existence, but maybe they don't have to require existence. Indeed, if you think about it, you might say, what better way to guarantee a deprivation than to not exist, right? So we might say it shouldn't puzzle us to think that the existence requirement might be false for certain deprivation bads. If you don't exist, obviously you can't receive the goods of life. And so you'll have the comparative bad of not receiving them, even though you don't exist. And so maybe we should just reject the existence requirement, at least as far as comparative bads are concerned, in which case we can still say, yes, death is bad for us. Maybe anybody who's clear-headedly embracing the deprivation account should just reject the existence requirement. And if that's Epicurus' argument, maybe we have an answer to Epicurus. Sadly, it's still not all smooth sailing. To see that, we need to think about somebody, a person who could have existed but never exists. A merely potential or merely possible person. Now, most of us are not used to thinking about merely possible people. So to make things slightly more intuitive, slightly more concrete, I need some volunteers. I need 2 volunteers. Can I have a show of hands so I can pick up some volunteers? Okay, guy in the back, woman up here. Okay, you don't have to get up. Thank you, though. But here's your assignment. Go have sex and have a baby. Okay. Okay, so now, sorry to disappoint you, let me just suppose that this isn't going to happen. I don't know who's more disappointed, but let's just suppose. Okay. But it could have happened, right? It could have happened that these 2 people would have had sex and had a baby. And, so her egg 37, would join, with his sperm 4,321,000, right? And the egg would have gotten fertilized, and the fetus would have grown, the baby would have been born. Let's call that baby that could have gotten born Larry. I've been talking about this stuff for years. I don't know why it's always Larry when I tell this story. Okay, so it's Larry. Okay, so Larry, I'm supposing, will never actually exist. But Larry could have existed. Larry's a merely possible but never actualized person. Now, anybody feel sorry for Larry? I suppose not. I'm certainly not seeing any hands. It seems odd, it seems bizarre to feel sorry for Larry. And yet, notice that it looks as though the deprivation account is saying we should feel sorry for Larry. After all, we feel sorry for you about the fact that you're going to die. Why? Because according to the deprivation account, by virtue of death, you will be deprived of, you will fail to get the good things in life that would otherwise come to you if only you hadn't died then. Shouldn't we feel even sorrier for Larry? Larry never gets to be born at all, so the deprivation is all the larger. If the badness of death consists in the failure to get the good things in life, there's even worse deprivation involved. In Larry's case, he never gets any of the good things in life. Now, if we had kept the existence requirement and had said, for things to be bad for you, you've got to exist, we would have had a perfectly good explanation as to why we don't feel sorry and shouldn't feel sorry for Larry. Larry doesn't exist, so his non-existence isn't bad for him. But we got rid of the existence requirement. We threw out the existence requirement in order to answer the second possible interpretation of Epicurus' argument. We needed to throw out the existence requirement in order to explain how death can be bad for you, even though you won't exist when you're dead. But having thrown out the existence requirement, it looks as though we should feel sorry for, and even more sorry for, Larry. But nobody is. Now, I've been prattling on about Larry for a couple of minutes now, so maybe some of you have started feeling sorry for Larry. And indeed, sometimes, when you talk about these things, people imagine, remember, we're thinking that, I'm here presupposing, I guess I haven't used this language before, I'm presupposing that there are no souls that could survive the death of our body. Similarly, there's no soul that exists before the birth, right? If you start thinking about Larry as having this ghost-like existence watching us from some ethereal realm, wishing he were alive, saying, gosh, wouldn't it be great to eat ice cream, right? If that's how you're picturing Larry, then, of course, maybe it is bad for Larry. But then Larry really is a conscious, existent being in this spooky, ghost-like way. But we're imagining Larry doesn't exist at all, in which case, that's not the right way to think about him. Still, you might have started feeling sad about Larry, so I want to make clear how many Larrys there are. How many merely possible, never actually born people there are. Well, I tried to calculate this once. And I'm going to share the calculation with you. It's as you'll see, it's a very crude, back-of-the-envelope sort of calculation. These numbers are very approximate. As you'll see, it really doesn't matter. There's a lot of rounding here. It just won't affect the bottom line. But in order to make sure I've got this right, I'm going to look at my note here. All right, so last time I looked, there were roughly 7 billion people. I didn't count them all. There were roughly 7 billion people alive. And in round numbers, half of them are men and half of them are women. And so what we want to get clear about is how many different children, in principle, could the current cohort of men have with the current cohort of women? And in thinking about this, the crucial thing to bear in mind is, of course, you get a different person, at least one, for each different sperm-egg combination. Right? If my parents had had sex 5 minutes earlier or 5 minutes later, a different sperm would have met up with the egg. And then that wouldn't have been me. That would have been some sibling of me who would have gotten born instead. So change the sperm-egg combo and you've got a different person. So what we really want to know is how many sperm-egg combinations could we create given the current generation of people? Well, 3.5 million women. All right, we need to know how many, 3.5 million women. 3.5 million women. Billion, thank you. Billion women. How many eggs can a woman produce? Well, in round numbers, a woman's fertile period, let's suppose, is something like 30 years. I'm rounding. And in round numbers, a woman produces 12 eggs a year. Actually, that grossly underestimates the number. I discovered that, in fact, women have many, many things that could have developed into eggs that don't ever develop into eggs, and that might give us even more combinations, but this will be more than enough. So 3.5 billion women times 30 years times 12 eggs a year. So that's how many eggs we've got available. Now, how many sperm are there? Well, times 3.5 billion men. Men can be fertile for a longer period than women. Let's round it to 50 years. Times 50 years. How many times can a man have? Oh, times 365 days, because man can have, times 365 days per year. Men can, of course, have sex more frequently than once a day, but we'll be modest here. And suppose we're only having sex once each day. How many sperm? So we're going to imagine the man ejaculating only once a day. How many sperm are there in a typical male ejaculate? I looked this up once. I didn't know. The answer is a lot. I mean, a lot. I was shocked. I mean, it's 40 million sperm per day, per ejaculate. So that's, the 3.5 billion times 50 years times 365 days times 40 million sperm a day. It's going to give you the number of eggs. So multiplying these numbers together is going to give you, in round numbers, the number of possible sperm-egg combinations, hence the number of possible people next generation. Of course, most of them can't be born. We don't have the resources, but any one of them could have been born. Rounding, that gives us, this equals approximately 3 times 10 to the 33rd. That's 3 million billion 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 possible people. That's a lot, right? And that's one generation down. Take now all those possible people and ask how many possible people could they have produced? Or how many possible grandchildren are there? If you go 2 generations down, the number is 5 times 10 to the 66th. Obviously, we couldn't have that many people, but that's how many possible people there could have been. Any one of them could have existed. After 3 generations, you end up with more possible people than there are particles in the known universe. That's a lot of possible people. Now, if we get rid of the existence requirement and say you don't have to exist for something to be bad for you, then we don't not only have to feel sorry for Larry, we have to feel sorry for every single one of those billions upon billions upon billions of never-to-be-born individuals. Without the existence requirement, it looks as though we're forced to say, the fact that all these merely possible people never get born is a moral tragedy of unspeakable proportions. We ought to just be, completely appalled at the fact that all these people will never be born. But, we're not appalled at the prospect of that. Now we're in trouble. We're really in a philosophical pickle now. I mean, if we keep the existence requirement, it looks as though at least the second interpretation of the Epicurean argument goes through. Keep the existence requirement allows us to say, we don't have to feel sorry for the untold, unborn billions. We don't have to feel sorry for them because they don't exist. Nothing's not bad about not existing. We don't have to feel sorry for them, but then we can't feel sorry for ourselves about the fact that we're going to die. We could reject the existence requirement, which allows us to retain the deprivation account and allows us to say that our death is bad for us. But then it seems we have to feel sorry for the unborn billions. What in the world are we supposed to do at this point? Well, I've got a proposal. I think it makes progress. What we'd like is to find some version of the existence requirement that somehow lets us feel sorry for ourselves without requiring us to feel sorry for Larry and the unborn billions. And I think we can do that by distinguishing between 2 different versions of the existence requirement, a modest version and a bold version. So the modest version says, for something to be bad, for you, you must exist. That's why it's an existence requirement. You must exist at some time or the other. The bold version, I'll come back to the difference in a moment. The bold version says, for something to be bad for you, you must exist at the same time as that thing. All right, the modest existence requirement I call because, of course, it's more modest, it's less demanding. It says something can be bad for you as long as you exist at some time or the other. Notice that it doesn't demand that you exist at the same time as the bad thing, the purportedly bad thing. The bold existence requirement, the bold version of this requirement goes further. It says for something to be bad for you, you must exist at the very same time as the bad thing. It's not good enough to exist at some time unless it's the very same time. That's why the bold version is more demanding. If we accept no existence requirement at all, then we're stuck feeling sorry for Larry and the unborn billions. That seems unacceptable. If we accept the bold version of the existence requirement, for something to be bad for you, you must exist at the very same time as that bad thing, then we're forced to say that death isn't really bad for you after all. Because although you do exist at some time, namely now, you won't exist at the time that the bad thing, death, your death, will exist. According to the bold version, you've got to exist at the same time. There's a simultaneity requirement built into the bold version. If we accept the bold version, we're able to avoid saying we need to feel sorry for the Larry and the untold billions, but we also have to say we can't feel sorry for you about the fact that you're going to die. But suppose instead of accepting the bold version or trying to make do without any version at all, suppose we accept the modest version. For something to be bad for you, you must exist at some time or the other. Notice that you pass that test, right? You all exist now. So you exist at some time or the other. And since you exist at some time or the other, death can be bad for you, even though you won't exist when you're dead. The modest existence requirement doesn't demand that you exist at the very same time as the bad thing. It only insists that you exist at some time or the other. But you do. You get in the club of things that we can feel sorry for. In contrast, Larry never exists. The unborn billions never exist. So they don't get in the club. They don't even meet the modest, minimal requirement of existing at some time or the other. So if we accept the modest version of the existence requirement, then we can say, you know what? Death is bad for us, but it's not bad never to be born at all. So that's progress. And I wish I could say, now all the problems are solved. But that's not quite right either, so I'm going to close with one last quick worry. So imagine somebody who's born, and he's got a nice long life. He lives 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years. Now compare that with the case in which you bring it about that instead of living the 90 years he would have lived if you hadn't gotten involved, he only lives 50 years. Well, you've deprived him of 40 years, which we can imagine are years that he would have enjoyed having, and so years with the good stuff in life. And so you've done something morally objectionable by shortening his life 40 years. And the deprivation account helps us see why that's objectionable. Imagine that instead of bringing it about that he dies at 50 rather than 90, you bring it about that he dies at 20. Well, that's even worse, because, of course, now there's the 70 years he would have had instead of merely the 40 extra years he would have had. You've deprived him of even more, so that's even worse. Suppose you bring it about that he dies at the age of 5. That's even worse. The deprivation is even bigger. Suppose you bring it about that he dies at the age of 1. Even worse. Suppose you bring it about that he dies at the age of 1 month. Even worse. Dies at the age of 1 day. Even worse. Dies at the age of 1 hour. Even worse. Dies at the age of 1 second. Even worse. Suppose you bring it about that he's never born at all. Oh, that's fine. What? But that's the implication of accepting the modest existence requirement. You were making things worse and worse and worse for him as long as it was still the case that he existed at some time or the other. I was making it almost maximally worse when I brought it about that he was only existing for 1 second instead of having his 90 years. But when I snip out that last fraction, that last moment, that last second, now he doesn't exist at some time or the other. Now I can't feel sorry for him at all. Now I haven't done anything wrong. That's surprising. Doesn't seem intuitive. But that's the implication of accepting the moderate existence requirement. So what should we say here? What is the plausible position to take? I actually think that here, as is often the case in thinking about issues in ethics, every contending position has problems. It would be nice if what we could just say is, here's the solution to all our problems, everything is sweetness and light, doesn't everything seem attractive here? That's just not the way it works in philosophy. It's more like, instead of finding what's the most plausible position, it's more like what we're looking for, what's the least implausible position? Should we do away with the existence requirement altogether and start feeling sorry for Larry and the untold billions? Should we accept the bold existence requirement and say, you know what, death isn't really bad for us after all? Should we split the difference with the modest existence requirement and then say, yeah, right, shortening somebody's life is worse and worse and worse until you bring it about that they're never born at all, in which case not a complaint in the world? What's the right thing to say? To be honest, I just don't know. Thanks.
We have one rule, actually, more than one, but one rule is that the first people to ask questions are students.
Great.
So faculty have to wait in line. And I will call on people who would like to have a question answered. So who would like to ask something? This is a student, right?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you just define what you mean by, when you say death is bad, what you mean by bad?
Wow, actually that's a great question, and I didn't see that one coming. There's no, I think, uncontroversial definition or analysis of what badness is, in part because the concept's so simple. But I can give you some examples. I mean, there are various things that can happen in your life, and we have different reactions to them. Some of them you want to have happen, and some of them you want to not have happen. So we sort them. Furthermore, these aren't just, I think, idiosyncratic reactions. Let me just give a couple. It's like, sorry to be, graphic, but I could blind you. I could stab you. I could give you cancer, right? I could give you horrible pain. I could torture you. These are things that you don't want, and the word we use for that is bad. And there are things that you do want. I could give you $1 million. I could give you an ice cream cone. Depending on your preferences, we could have sex. Let's skip that last one. I can give you an air conditioner. You're in Texas. I assume that would be a helpful thing to have, an air conditioner in Texas. And those are things that would be reasonable for you to want. The word we use for that is good. And the point is that these aren't just idiosyncratic preferences. They're rational, they're reasonable preferences. And so something along the lines of things that you want or wish would happen are good. Things that you want or wish would not want to not happen or wish would not happen, those things are bad. And what most of us think is something like, we wish we wouldn't die. Death is bad. Now, I mean, there's a further question. Would it be good to live forever? Actually, nothing that I've said yet guarantees that. Put it more positively, you could think that death is bad while consistently still thinking immortality wouldn't be good either. But unless somebody's curious about that, we don't have to go there. But anyway, I think, does that give you enough for what I was trying to get at? And the thought's just, most of us think, we're upset at the prospect that we're going to die, at least as soon as we are. We're going to have our measly 80, 90 years or whatever it might be, 100 if you're extraordinarily lucky, and then that's it. We'd rather that not happen. We think of death as a bad thing. We take pains to avoid it. That's why you look both ways, as I hope you do, when you cross the street.
What do you have someone who's like ready to die? They have cancer, they're in pain, their whole family knows that once they're suffering and slowly can be relieved themselves. At that point, is it still bad? Is death regardless?
No, great, good. So let's think about the deprivation account, right? So the deprivation account says death is bad. When I was more careful, I wasn't probably careful most of the time, but at least occasionally I tried to be careful, and I would have said something like, or even if I didn't ever say it, let me say it now. The deprivation account says death is bad for you when it's bad for you by virtue of the fact that you are being deprived of a chunk of life that would have been good overall. You got to throw some of those qualifications in, right? I mean, after all, I don't know about you, but certainly my life has its downsides, and so I'm not saying death's only bad for you if the next chunk of life would have been 100% good, no bad in it. It's just got to be good overall, worth having. If it is, or would have been good for you overall, then death is bad for you. But precisely for that reason, we can flip it around in just the way that you have. If there's a case where then living another 6 months or a year or week even would be bad for you, bad overall, more pain than pleasure, more intrinsic bads than intrinsic goods, then what you're being deprived of isn't something good, but rather something bad. Death is bad when it deprives you of something good, but when it's depriving you of something bad, something worth avoiding, something where it's rational to wish it wasn't going to happen, then death isn't bad, death is actually good. So the deprivation account not only allows you to say what I'm assuming that you were suggesting, but indeed it requires us to say, if life can become so bad that you're better off dead, then indeed death in that circumstance isn't bad for you.
Have you ever considered the same concept under a different assumption that there is something after death?
So the question, I'm not sure you all heard, was, have I ever considered the question about the badness of death under the assumption that there is something after death? So what I was talking about today is a piece of a class I teach on death. And although for today's purpose, I helped myself to the assumption that there is no soul, the death of your body is the death of you, that it's just the end. I don't take that for granted in my class. If we had more time, I would spell out the various arguments for believing in the existence of a soul. And obviously, if you come to so as it happens, I think those arguments are not sufficiently persuasive, so I do not believe there's a soul. But reasonable people disagree about these things, as is always the case in philosophy. So if you help yourself to the thought, or you've been persuaded of the claim that there is a soul, well, actually, we need a bit more, right? Because suppose what we mean by soul is something like an immaterial, the house of consciousness or the mind or the personality or something. That opens the door to there being something after your death. Right, the body dies, but the immaterial soul could still exist. After all, it's immaterial. But it's probably worth emphasizing the thought that, or at least noticing the thought that, even if we believe in souls, it doesn't mean that we continue to exist after the death of your body. After all, there's this really tight connection between your soul and your body, right? If I prick your flesh with a pin, your soul feels pain. When your soul gives orders to your body, your fingers start, moving around. So there's this real tight two-way causal street between your soul, supposing there were one, and your body, in which case it could turn out that when your body dies, horrifically enough, this process gets set up where it kills your soul at the same time, in which case believing in the soul isn't enough to get us past the kind of question we were thinking about today. But suppose you think, oh, no, not only is there a soul, it survives death, right? And so, we have to ask, what other additional arguments do we have for believing in the immortality of the soul, or at least the ability of the soul to survive the death of the body? And then, might death be good or bad for you? Well, I suppose it depends on what you think's going to happen to the soul after you die. And, at this point, I think the evidence, such as it is slim. But maybe now we'd have to turn it into a question about religious testimony and the like, and I think that's probably a discussion for another day.
Yeah, on your question, well, 2 questions ago about the comments on deprivation, it seems like you're granting that people can be able to look into the future and determine how their life's going to turn out, good or bad.
And the unstated part of your question is, but we can't?
But I mean, yeah, there's no way to tell.
Yeah, there's no way to tell for sure.
I mean, right, in the instance, he has cancer right now, but there's no way to tell in 10 years if he's going to be cured.
Yeah.
And that, he'll live to be another 50 years beyond that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's right. We certainly don't have a crystal ball. So that fact becomes especially relevant in thinking about questions about suicide, right? Because when you're killing yourself, you're making a prediction about what would the future look like. And as you're completely correctly and helpfully pointing out, since we don't have a crystal ball, at best we're making a guess about the odds or something like that. Some people take that thought and conclude, so suicide never makes sense because you're throwing away the only chance of good things, and it could happen after all, right? And this is also a complicated issue, but to give the short version of it, I think if one took that attitude about suicide, then you'd be using different rules with regard to playing the odds than the rules we normally use, I suppose, when we're making decisions. So, we face the fact that we don't have a crystal ball, all the time, right? And so we try to make judgments based on our best assessment of the various possibilities and the likelihoods. And that makes the decision-making more complicated, but we don't normally say, since I don't have a crystal ball, I guess I just won't decide. I think in cases of suicide, it gives us reason to hesitate, but it also still leaves the door open to sometimes that being a rational choice. Notice, by the by, that if you were going to say about the patient that was being described a few minutes ago, where somebody in the terminal stages of cancer and so forth and so on, and if we say, based on our available evidence, it looks as though it's a good thing that he died now, at least his suffering is over sooner rather than continuing, you say correctly, that's our best guess, but we can't know for sure. I agree. I think that's our best guess, though we can't know for sure. But note similarly then that if you were to die, just to be graphic again, if you were to die tomorrow, we would normally feel, oh my God, what a tragedy. But well, you won't be around to say it, so I should have picked somebody else. But if somebody next to you, had said, well, it's our best guess that it's a tragedy, but we can't know for sure. Maybe he would have gotten kidnapped by alien Martians who would have tortured him for 70 years, right? So it was a good thing that at least he escaped the torture. Yeah, that's a possibility. But based on the available evidence, looks as though it was a bad thing you died, good thing this guy died.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, sir. First off, I just want to say thank you for helping me with my women issues. Me and my mate will treasure Larry forever. And second of all, I was just wondering, when you're talking about comparative good, I tend to think more in the terms of less good and more good, because when you think about how things could have been, it seems like you can always imagine something better that could happen to you if you just done something different, in any situation. So I'm wondering if that's really a good way to measure goodness or badness.
Well, I don't think it's the only way to measure goodness or badness. I suggested, look, there's at least 3, and probably for certain purposes we'd want even more than 3 types of ways things could be bad, or, though I wasn't emphasizing it, good. And you're right that in the comparative case, you said the way you prefer to think about it is more good or less good, but actually that just is the comparative point, right? The $10 envelope versus the $1,000 envelope. The $10 envelope's good. It's just what's bad about it is simply that it's less good than the $1,000 envelope. The reason I prefer to describe it in comparative terms is that, well, suppose that there were 3 envelopes, and the envelope you opened had nothing in it. Now, there's nothing intrinsically bad about not getting any money right then. I mean, you didn't get any extra money right now, right? But no, oh my God, I didn't get it. So there's nothing intrinsically bad about the 0, and there's nothing necessarily instrumentally bad about the 0. It's just comparatively bad. So the comparisons are a larger set than just small good versus big good. It can also be 0 versus big good. And that's, I think, the relevant one for thinking about the badness of death, right? The whole point is when you don't exist, it's not a negative. It's not a small versus a large positive. If we were going to slap a number on it, it would be a 0. Is that? Okay, good.
It occurs to me, actually, that we have some non-student, non-faculty visitors here. I don't know if anyone actually falls in that category and wants to ask a question before we get to faculty. Shall we say?
Yeah, I'm one of those visitors. So you were talking about the modest and the full proposal, and I was just wondering, with the gentleman behind me, when he was talking about you don't know if the terminal disease is bad enough, what about the life that they're taking away from that caregiver? That would be better if the person ended their suffering.
So I don't think I had the case exactly. Can you just say a little bit more? Tell me the story that you got in mind.
Like in the case of like a terminal cancer patient,
right,
where the caregiver, like say it's a family member, and their life is devoted to taking care of that family member. But if they weren't taking care of that family member, then they would be off doing something else that would be more good for them.
So look, it's if we started trying to talk about the whole ethics of end-of-life issues, obviously there'd be a lot of people we'd want to be thinking about. We'd want to be thinking. I mean, I've been focusing on what's good or bad about death for the person whose life is coming to an end. You're completely correctly pointing out that in real life cases is more than one person. There's the caregiver. There's which may or may not be the same person as the family members and the people that that love them. And while we're at it, there's the other people who aren't getting medical help because society's only willing to put a certain limited number of resources into it. And if we weren't spending the money on keeping this person alive, maybe we'd have more money, for prenatal care, right? And so there's a whole lot of aspects of the question if we really wanted to tackle a policy question about end of life. I wasn't trying to do that here. To do that, you would have to think about the advantages and interests and as well as the claims and rights of each of the relevant parties. But clearly, one party we'd need to get clear on would be the person whose life is potentially coming to an end. And to weigh in that person's claims, we better at least decide, is it bad for them to die or not? So I focused on that not because I thought that's the whole story, but just because you got to talk about something. That's the one I picked for today.
Both?
Like if it's bad to deprive something before you're born, you don't exist. Then like when you're born, you're using your non-existence. So is existence bad based on that, or is it like how do you?
So there's the question that I thought you were about to ask, and then the way it ended. Right. So let me say something about the way it ended, and then where I thought maybe you were going, but maybe you weren't. We'll see. Is existence bad? After all, not only does your existence come to an end, there was a period before you were born, or strictly speaking, before you were conceived, or something like that. When you didn't exist, and so is coming into existence bad? No. Think about what you're likely to want to say if you accept the deprivation account. If the deprivation account is right, then what we're saying is, basically, for those of us who are fortunate enough to have decent lives, life's good. Losing it is bad because you're not getting any more of that good stuff. That's why death is bad. But that means being born, coming into existence, is good because now you get to start having the candy, right? You start getting the goodies. So as far as where you ended, straightforward. No, if your life's going to be a good one, then we can just say, yeah, you look back and say, I'm glad I was born. And certainly when I look back, I do feel, my gosh, I've had a wonderful life. I'm so glad I was born. But there is a puzzle in the neighborhood of what you were talking about, and that's this. If we had even more time, we could pursue this. There's another classic puzzle about death from the ancient world. This one comes from Lucretius. And Lucretius pointed out, just as you did, that look, there are actually two periods of non-existence. There's the one that happens after death, and there's the one that happens before you're born. Again, putting aside the complication that you may exist for a little bit before you're born. There's the one before birth, non-existent, an infinitely long period. There's the one after death, an infinitely long period. If the post-life period is so bad, Lucretius says, because you don't exist, by consistency, you would have to say that the pre-birth period is bad too. If being upset at the post-life one made sense, you ought to be upset at the fact that there was this eternity that you were never born yet. But nobody's upset at the eternity that they were never born, at the fact that there was this eternity when you didn't exist. And so, Lucretius concluded, it doesn't make sense to be upset about the post-life eternity either. You got to be consistent here. That's Lucretius's puzzle. And it's a good one, right? I mean, yeah, I suppose most of us intuitively feel, isn't there some difference here that we can put our finger on? But, if I had another half hour, we could work our way through some of the various proposals that have been made, and we could say, this one doesn't quite do the trick, that one doesn't quite do the trick. It's at least not obvious what the best answer to Lucretius might be. So when I said I was going to talk about some of the puzzles about the badness of death, I don't at all mean to suggest I've talked about all of them.
Let's move forward to, say, it's the years 2050, and Ray Kurzweil and others have been successful in reverse engineering the human brain, and super AI exists, and technology is going at a rate we can't even imagine how far it's advancing. Okay. And so now people with money can have their brains uploaded into machines and exist until somebody pulls the power plug.
Yeah.
Now, does that change any way about the badness of death or any of this stuff?
Yes, but and that's a wonderful, of course, case to think about. But sadly, the answer depends on, as I'm sure you realize, we have to ask a whole bunch of other questions first. So one question is that creature that now exists, so they'll be uploaded on some computer program, or maybe it'll be implanted in some new Android body, right? There'll be somebody who's got, I'll tell the story about me, because I like me. There'll be somebody who's got Shelley Kagan's memories. There'll be somebody or something that's got Shelley Kagan's desires and goals and ambitions and so forth. There'll be somebody who's thinking, I'm Shelley Kagan, right? We have to ask ourselves, in part, yes, but is that creature Shelley Kagan? Maybe it's just some creature that's deluded, into thinking that it's Shelley Kagan. There's this huge topic, the philosophy of personal identity. And there are rival views about what's the glue that makes some future person the same person as this person sitting here talking to you right now. There are different theories. On some of those theories, that thing that you described will be me. And on some of those theories, that thing that you described won't be me. Obviously, if we think it will be me, then it's not clear that it's right to say death is the end. It's more like, you wear out your jeans and you can move on to a new pair of jeans, but that's not the death of you, right? And so my death won't really be the end of my existence. Maybe we wouldn't even call it death, at that point. It would be just body replacement, like, hair transplant or something, right? So to really make progress on that question, which is a wonderful question to think about, we would have to spend now a whole lot more time trying to get clear about the nature of personal identity and so forth. And there's one other aspect of the question, which is, even if it's not me, could it be the case that it gives me most of or all of what I wanted when I wanted it to be me. We want to survive. We think there's something in it for us in surviving, something that matters. And one thing that we need to get clear on, and to really do justice to all the questions about the ethics and the metaphysics of life and death, we need to get clear on what is it that matters in survival. And I'm drawn to ideas that suggest what matters in survival can be had in certain instances even when you haven't survived. And I suspect that that's the right thing to say about the uploading scenario. But to make good on that thought, longer answer than we have time for.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up one case I think may be an exception to the idea of death is bad when it deprives you of what is good. The case of the hero who sacrifices his life to save other lives.
Right.
I mean, basically he's giving up something good.
Right.
But is death in that case not good?
Good. That's great. So I should have said, I mean, there are no doubt, there are many things that have to be sufficiently careful I should have said, but then I would have spent the full hour giving all the qualifiers and hedges and the fine print, right? So I don't give a lot of the fine print because I only have whatever it is, the 50 minutes. Here's one of the bits of the fine print that the lawyers should have told me to put in, right? I should have said that in talking about is death bad or death good, I don't mean morally bad or good. I mean good for you, a benefit to you, or a harm to you. Certainly what I want to say, at least as a first pass about the case of heroic sacrifice, is his death or her death is bad for him or her, but a morally praiseworthy thing, a morally good thing. And so armed with this distinction between, you might say, what's in the interests of the individual versus what's morally asked of them, armed with that distinction, we can say it was a good thing from the point of view of morality, but a bad thing from the point of view of the hero's self-interest. The answer, I should probably stop there, but in fact, I can't control myself, so we can make it even more complicated, because I wouldn't want to suggest that there's no connection between the two. It's an interesting question to what extent is doing something morally admirable, the kind of sacrifice you've got in mind, to what extent does that actually benefit me? The simple picture is you simply sacrificed your well-being for the sake of something morally admirable. That's great, but you lost. A subtler position would suggest there's something in it for me about acting and behaving admirably. And I'm sympathetic to that view. Of course, then we'd still want to know, yes, but how much is in it for me? Am I net winning, net losing? I think we're going to still need to make use of this distinction.
I've been thinking about your last puzzle that you talked about in the lecture, and does it help to say that death deprives someone not just of good things happening to them, but of their plans for the future?
Great. So I obviously was very hand-wavy. Indeed, I think I probably said almost nothing concrete about what the good things in life are. I talked about the fact that death deprives us of them, and I rattled off a couple of cheap, easy examples, sex and ice cream. But there's obviously many, many others, and many others that matter very significantly and appropriately so. One of them is, I think, carrying out plans and accomplishing something. And to really, again, I said, you start thinking about the philosophical issues surrounding death, and they become very, very complicated. As I've already mentioned, I teach an entire class, on the subject, and we begin to see some sense of why you really need that to move in all the relevant directions. So one thing that we would probably want to do would be, in principle, to try to spell out more about what the goods might be that are that we lose. You know, one of the bad things about death is I don't get a chance to carry out my plans. If you do go that way, and put enough weight on it, it's a further question how much weight on it you should put, right? But if you put enough weight on it, then the thing I was saying earlier, and I'm imagining this is part of what you saw, it won't get worse and worse. Death happening at a younger and younger age won't actually necessarily be worse and worse and worse. Because when you make the kid young enough, toddler, infant, baby has no plans at all. So at least the baby's not yet being deprived of, put it more the other way around, the baby's not going to have the bad of having its plans come to nothing. There's a moral philosopher, Jeff McMahon, teaches at Rutgers, who's pursued this idea, not exactly in those terms, but I think it's roughly the idea. And he says, look, the younger you die, the worse it is, but then the curve changes. Kind of it bottoms out and then goes back up somewhat. And as you get young enough, you're not invested in your future in the same way that we all are. And that makes a difference to how bad death is. And that's it's an extra complication, but it's a very, very nice thought. Just to give you a nice taste of, isn't philosophy marvelous? So this message is brought to you by the philosophy board of, So suppose we go with that thought and then ask ourselves, what should we say about the death of animals, non-human animals? How bad is that? And then this point about plans and being invested in your future, it's plausible to think that at least for many of the lower animals, they don't project themselves into the future in the same way that we do, in which case we'll have the beginnings of an explanation about why death for them, although perhaps bad, isn't bad in the same way that death for us is. It's a very, very deep point. Yeah, nice.
All right, so you labeled pain as intrinsically bad, right?
Yes.
Would you support the idea that happiness is the only thing that is intrinsically good? And if so, why is it intrinsically good?
Good. So the question was, is happiness the only intrinsically good? And by happiness, am I right in thinking, since you were contrasting it with pain, that you mean pleasure? You're sort of using happiness and pleasure the same way? What's that?
Pleasure, happiness, well-being.
Yeah, well, so I would not use those three terms synonymously. So well-being is just the term I would use for this whole theory of the stuff that's good and bad to have in a life, right? Including some of these complications about the investment in your future and having your plans come to fruition point. And the point I was gesturing at earlier about maybe acting admirably is also good for you. So indeed, I do not think that pleasure is the only good thing. I don't think it's the only intrinsically good thing. So comparative good, comparative bads are bad because you could have had more of the good stuff. What good stuff? Well, the intrinsically good stuff. What's the intrinsically good stuff? There is a classical philosophical position that says pleasure is the only intrinsically good thing, pain's the only intrinsically bad thing. I do not myself believe that is true. I think that there are other things above and beyond pleasure and pain, or above and beyond your experiences and your mental states. So that I think love, and I don't just mean the experience of love, but actually being loved, being in a loving relationship, is an intrinsically good thing. It's in your interest. Well, I think it does make you happy, but I don't think its contribution to your pleasure exhausts its value. So I'm going to give an example here to really, now this is going to open up the floodgates, and we won't be able to pursue this either, but here's an example. Some of you may be familiar with it. Some of you won't have heard of it before. This comes from a guy named Robert Nozick. He taught at Harvard for many, many years. It's called the Experience Machine. Here's the quick version of it. Imagine the super duper scientists, neuroscientists, have figured out how to stimulate your brain exactly, precisely the way to create whatever experiences you would have had if you were doing fill in the blank. so that we can give you exactly the same experiences on the inside that you would have if you were climbing Mount Everest, right? So it's not like being at the IMAX where you think, wow, isn't this realistic? Just like you're not sitting here right now thinking, wow, isn't this realistic? You just take it to be real, right? So when you're on the experience machine, you don't know you're on the experience machine. You feel, or at least you think you feel, the wind whipping across your face. You remember the thrill of almost having the rope snap a minute ago. Of course, there was no rope. You're just floating in the psychologist's tank. But on the inside, it's exactly the same. Indistinguishable. No way to tell. Perfect simulation. All right. Now, imagine you filled in the program with whatever you think is the best kind of life in terms of happiness. Whether it's being creative or making fantastic discoveries or being really, really rich or having a lot of ice cream or sex, whatever it might be, right? And now everybody's got to ask yourself, what would you feel about the prospect of spending your entire life on that machine playing that kind of program? What would you feel about discovering on your deathbed that your whole life had been an illusion and you were only on such a machine? What would you think if I offered you the prospect of having your firstborn child live their entire life on such a machine? Do you think that life on such a machine gives you everything worth having in life from a kind of self-interested perspective? In terms of what's in it for me, does that machine give you everything? Now, I've been discussing these issues with students, audiences, for many, many, many years. Example's not mine, but I've been discussing it for many, many years. And it's almost always the case, you'll have to each of you think about yourself, that most people think there's something missing from life on the experience machine. There's always some who don't. Maybe you are one of the people who think there's nothing missing from that machine. But most of us think there is something missing, and that at least suggests that for most of us, these other things, the things that are missing, really being in love, really having made a discovery, really having been creative, really having accomplished something, and so forth and so on, those things are valuable above and beyond their impact on your pleasures, your experiences. Whether that's a good enough argument, well, again, sadly, these things are complicated and we don't have the time to, it would be another entire day's worth of discussion. But at least that's the sort of thing I find sufficiently persuasive in my own case to make me quite confident that, at least as far as what I care about, it's not just happiness. One last sentence about this, though. The way I just put it was, there's more to life worth having than happiness. But sometimes the way I would put it is, there's more to happiness than just getting the insides right. The experience machine gets the insides right, but doesn't get the outsides right. And so we'd have to get into a question as well about what's the right definition of happiness.
Just in response to the modest idea that you had, the modest existence principle, in relation to the comparative bad and good, could you say that a comparative bad is only if you have knowledge or experience of both things, not only if you just existed, but if you have the actual knowledge, like if you're watching TV and you don't know how nice a party is, then obviously it's not worse. And that could explain the kind of the modest proposal for the existence theory, is that if you die at a very young age, well, you have no experience or knowledge of anything that's better than that, so it's not necessarily bad.
So the proposal is this: here's the right way to run, if I'm understanding you correctly, here's the right way to run the modest existence requirement. You've got to have knowledge of what you're foregoing. This is, I hope you'll see, very closely connected to the question that we were just talking about with the experience machine, right? People who are happy on the experience machine, let's say people who are willing to go into the experience machine, basically are saying what you don't know can't hurt you, right? And that's what you've just given us, another way of expressing that same thought. I've already revealed the fact that I don't believe that slogan. So I'm not myself sympathetic to the idea that the only comparative bads are comparative bads that you're aware of, having been on the losing side of the comparison, right? Economists sometimes talk about these things as opportunity costs, right? And so we could say your proposal is that the only genuine opportunity costs are opportunity costs that you're aware of. As I say, I don't find that, I don't believe that. But suppose we did believe it. Are you saying then that to be undergoing a comparative bad, I've got to be aware while it's going on that there's something better I could have been having? So it's not enough to be watching the TV show. I've got to be aware there's a party I could have been at. If we go that route, it has an implication that you may not be happy with. When we now say, okay, so is death bad for you? If death is non-existence, when you don't exist, you're not thinking to yourself, oh golly, I wish I was in Philadelphia. In which case, on your proposal, there is no comparative bad of the relevant sort, but there's no intrinsic bad, there's no instrumental bad, and now we don't even have a comparative bad of the relevant sort. You're stuck saying with Epicurus, death isn't bad for you. Are you prepared to go there? No, okay. I thought not, right? And this is why it's really hard doing philosophy. All right? Yeah. So you see a problem over here and you figure, oh, I can fix that up. But then when you fix that up, it's got connections with what you wanted to say over there. And the philosophical game, project, life, is trying to put a picture together that the whole thing hangs together in an acceptable fashion. And it's surprisingly difficult to do.
It occurs to me that we do have an honored faculty guest here who's also going to speak. So I just want to give you an opportunity, if you would. This is Jennifer Hawkins, who's going to be talking tomorrow. So,
I figured I was talking tomorrow, so I just.
Oh, okay. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I figured that since okay.
I'll ask. I would go back to your last puzzle. And so, as you deprive someone of life at 50, and then bad, and then keep going back and going back. And then suddenly, and I wasn't sure if this had to do with the implication about birth versus when you come into existence, but at 1 second it was even worse, and then suddenly it wasn't bad at all. Why was that supposed to be puzzling?
So you find that intuitive?
Well, if the person, if we go back to before the person exists,
right,
then I make it the case that they don't exist, but is that different from not bringing one of the possible people?
No, indeed. I mean, it just is. It's turning this person from an actual, admittedly only a 1 second actual, but an actual to a mere possible.
Right, so at one point, I take something that was actual and, stop it, deprive the actual thing from its now 90 years of life, because of minus 1 second. I deprive it of that. But if I prevent the thing from coming into being at all.
Yeah, so I hardly tell you, that's another aspect of the philosophy of business, right? Is that, so you're just speaking
Isn't that
like...
what birth control does?
So your intuitions are in line with the modest existence requirement, and more power to you. And sometimes, you go, girl, right? Yeah, and sometimes, my intuitions are in line with the modest position as well. Indeed, when you put it that way, isn't that just what birth control does? It just makes sure the person never becomes actual. Who, if he hadn't, would have gotten pregnant, would have had, maybe 90 years, whatever. Then I say, yeah, that seems just fine. But when I think about it as shortening, then it seems weird. That's just reporting my intuitions. But of course, anybody who doesn't have those intuitions needn't be troubled by this point. Just like, anybody who's happy to go into the experience machine needn't be troubled by the question, what else is of value in life? I will confess that there are plenty of times when I think, we should feel sorry for the billions. I'm just of no settled mind about this issue. I was trying. Glad to hear I succeeded.
I guess we're on to faculty now. Yes. Our faculty.
Well, first let me say that I had Jennifer's intuition as well. I was like, yeah, now you haven't done anything bad, but you deprive him of 99 years of life. He's had that 1 second. So I had that same intuition, but I have a different question about the modest existence requirement. What bothered me about it is it just looks terribly ad hoc. It just looks like we've gone from a really plausible principle, which is the bold experience requirement, and we've gone to one that's just cooked up just for the purposes of avoiding this counterexample. And so I wonder if you had anything to say about that, like maybe a step or two down the line, or whether you had some case to be made that it's not ad hoc because it'll explain some other things.
Yeah, I've got something to say, but it's not going to be helpful. Or maybe it'll be helpful. It's when I am in my modest moods, that is to say, in those moods where I'm inclined to accept the modest principle, unlike Jennifer and you, I have the intuition that there was something weird about that last example. So for me, the modest principle does strike me as ad hoc. It's simply something I cooked up to avoid Epicurus on the one hand, or feeling sorry for the billions, on the other hand, right? The only way to avoid both of those was to cook something up. This did the trick. You shouldn't feel it's ad hoc, just like Jennifer didn't feel it was ad hoc. That just seems like, well, duh, this is exactly the principle that matches our intuitions, right? What's ad hoc about stating the principle that matches our intuitions? So I'm not sure whether that's helpful or not. But now that two of you have said, you've got the contrary intuition of mine, let me say something a bit about there's more trouble with the modest view. It's not technically a problem per se for the modest view, but I think it's going to be difficult to stick to the modest view. Well, you'll see the problem. It has to do with a slightly different issue, a set of issues having to do with birth and death and so forth. So, case number one, you could have a child, and you decide not to. Well, so Jennifer is saying, well, okay, so I didn't have a child, right? That's just saying I'm not feeling sorry for the untold billions. Put that same point the other way around. To feel sorry for them is to think that you've got some reason to try to bring them into existence. But a lot of people don't think there is any particularly real moral reason to bring extra people into existence. Okay, so good. That's thought number one. Thought number two, you could have a child, but this child's going to be suffering from some horrible birth defect, and so have a miserable, miserable, painful life until it dies at the age of 4. Whatever it is you think are the good things in life, it won't have them. Whatever you think the horrible things in life are, it's going to have them piled on in terms of pain, suffering, misery. Do you have a reason to not have the miserable child? Yes, you do. I imagine everybody thinks that. Okay. But now we have an asymmetry here that does seem ad hoc. Of course, you might just think, well, that's just the facts. But there is something puzzling about what is it about suffering that could be created that gives me a reason to not create it, while pleasure that could be created doesn't give me a reason to create it. Why is, as it were, here I am, neither of these children is actual. The merely possible, it's as though, I'm not really taking this metaphysically literally, but just to give you kind of picturesque way of thinking about it, it's as though the never-to-be-born miserable child is speaking to me from mere possibility land, saying, don't have me. And by golly, I'd better listen to that voice. While the never-to-be-born happy child is speaking to me from possibility land, saying, please have me. And I don't have to listen to that voice. Why is it? They're both just possibilities. Of course, you could say, but if you had the miserable child, there'd be this actual child who is miserable who'd be there complaining, and that's why you shouldn't do it. Well, that's true. But of course, if I had the happy child, there'd be this actual child here, busy, being grateful. So it still seems symmetrical. So the modest views got some kind of alliance with the asymmetry view, and the asymmetry view, although very widely in terms of matching our intuitions, is puzzling. And so that's, further reason why it's not all smooth sailing there either.
Yeah, it seems like there's something about our intuitions about harm or deprivation that could be used to save the deprivation account while rejecting an existence requirement that I want to suggest. So, at least our initial intuitions, suppose I had a family heirloom that I treasured and I lost it. It seems like there's something tragic about it. I've been deprived of something or I'm harmed in some way. Compare that to a case where I never had it, and there was no presumption that I could have had one or should have had one. Similarly, another case, the point is there's some kind of comparative relevant contrast in contrast cases. So when someone comes into existence, there's a default sort of presumption that they could have lived a certain amount of time. And when they fail to do so, we feel they've been deprived or harmed by not doing so. But if someone never comes into existence, there's kind of that default assumption that they could have lived a certain life is kind of not relevant somehow, or not. It's not a default assumption. So we have these contrasting intuitive judgments. It's like never having anything to inherit, never having anything to lose. Now, under scrutiny, we can philosophically question why does this really make a difference? And I sympathize with that. But as far as the explanation of our judgments about the cases, it seems to me this is kind of something that goes on all the time. If you lose $10, that's a harm. If there's a guy that's just like you but never had the $10, we can scrutinize and say, why didn't $10? But in a sense, he isn't deprived in the same way.
Suppose you've never had the $10, but you would have had the $10 coming to you, but then they don't come to you. Is that still worrisome?
Well, I think there's, whether this is defensible or if I'm just scrutinizing my judgment about it, kind of our initial judgment, there's some sense of having deserved, if they, what deservedly would have or could have or should have had $10. And for whatever reason, we don't think that merely possible persons have any kind of default desert to come into existence. Now, whether now again, I think at the end of the day, we can scrutinize this intuition, and I may think it falls apart, but I do think this is what's going on in these cases. I mean, maybe you could just endorse the intuition.
So I agree that there are. You've helped to a couple different locutions that I think are trying to get at the same thought. And I think it just is this thought, right? It's basically what you're saying is that the person, once they're born, once they come into existence, deserves their 90 years, their 80 years, or they have a claim to it, or there's a default assumption they've got it coming to them or something like that. Whereas there is no comparable default assumption for the merely possible never to be actualized.
Okay, here's a different case, though, that makes suggest that it's actually not that. So suppose I find out that there's aliens that live, they're like us, but they live for 200 years. Do I feel deprived by my mere 100 years?
Good.
Now, contrast that. Half the human population, for some genetic reason, lives for 200 years, but I'm one of the unfortunate souls who only lives for 100. I do feel deprived in this case, but I don't in the other. Now, why? Again, it's because for some reason, these aliens are not relevant in comparing what I would have can reasonably expect to have had, whereas other humans are relevant. We can also look at other previous generations. I can get in the mode of feeling tragic that people used to die at the age of 40. That I can feel, especially as you get close to 40. But it feels less tragic than someone now dying at 40.
Yeah. So that's great. So I may not fully get what you're trying to articulate here, but it seemed to me as though there were two ideas that I'd want to separate. So one idea was bracket the question of how we fix the relevant amount. Is it 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, what have you? Is that relative to our species, relative to our time? You know, bracket that for the moment, because that's the second question. What do you need to get a claim to that sized package? And it seemed to me your first thought was you get a claim to feasible, right? And of course, life doesn't always cooperate, but you get whatever the relevant moral normative expectation claim to that size package once you're born. But if you're never born, you haven't got it. And I think that just is this. That just is another way of stating the modest existence requirement. Once you exist at some time or the other, we can start feeling sorry for you if you don't get the package that you were entitled to, right? But if you didn't exist at all, if you're a merely possible person, then you didn't exist at some time or the other, and so you're not entitled to that package. We're not going to get. So I think what you've done is give, as it were, the first strand of your remarks, you've given voice to the modest existence requirement. And of course, the more ways we find of giving voice to it, the less we're going to feel it's ad hoc, and we're just going to say, you know, that's we've discovered a principle here, right? You know, ad hoc's such a delicate matter. You know, when we start deriving the rules of planetary motion based on our observations, somebody says, "Oh my God, that's so ad hoc." We say, "No, what an amazing discovery!" Right? So when is it cheating? When isn't it cheating? It's not always clear. But anyway, that was strand number one. Strand number two, which I think is separate, is once we've settled the question, who's got a claim to the package, merely possibles or only actuals, what size package do they have a claim to? As you say, you know, we feel sorry for ourselves when we don't get our 90 years. We don't feel sorry in the same way that we don't get 10,000 years or 1,000,000 years, you know, or 1 billion years or what have you. What is the, you know, why not? You know, shouldn't it, you know, suppose we wanted to ask ourselves, how bad is it to die? The deprivation account, after all, on the face of it, not only gives us an account of what's bad about death, or when is death bad, but how bad death is. Death is worse the more you're deprived. Well, right? So how much am I deprived of? Let's just suppose that you thought immortality would be a great thing. I'm not sure it would be, but I think I'd get bored after about 1,000,000 years or something like that. But 1,000,000's enough, so let's just go with 1,000,000. I die at 50. Now, I die at 90. What have I been deprived of? Well, I could have had 990,910 more years, good years, right? Suppose, tragically, I die at 20. That seems a whole lot worse. What have I been deprived of? 990,980, right? What's that difference? It seems so big when we were talking 90 versus 20. But in terms of what I was deprived of, it's not even 1%. Not even 0.1%, right? I hope I'm doing the math right, but you see the point. And so you're certainly right. There's some further thought here that needs to be explored about what sets the reasonable expectation border such that we can measure how much deprivation is. Because if it's too big, then we won't have any way of really feeling sorry for kids that die in their childhood versus people that die of 90. And that seems like that's unacceptable as well. There have been people who've thought that that sort of worry dooms the deprivation account. I'm not sure. And you weren't actually suggesting that. You were just suggesting we need to be sufficiently sensitive in terms of which size package is the right size package. And you're raising, I mean, these are obviously important, and I don't even have worked out views about how sorry should we feel about people dying at age of 40 in the Middle Ages as opposed to people dying 40 now. Versus there's complicating factors there about what was actually feasible, but yeah, just right. That would all need to be worked out too, and I wish I had that worked out, and I don't.
I think we have time for one more question. Actually, Steve is first.
I think when you first started talking, I thought you stupid my question, and then I'm not sure. But it seems like there's a reason why we don't have to feel sorry about these people, and it's not, and you might want to say we don't have to feel sorry for it. It doesn't have to, even if we drop the existence part. It's not their non-existence exactly that means that we don't have to feel sorry for them. It's their not being deprived. Right? Because if you think of deprivation, it's like a depriving act or event. I don't want to say it has to be intentional. If you just say it's deprivation, that there's some act or event that precludes some future possibility.
Yeah.
Okay. That's one thing. But how about if deprivation requires you, as it seems like you said in your first part of the response, that deprivation is depriving you of something that would have come their way had there not been the intervening act or event. And it seems like when these people are not brought into existence, potential people are not brought into existence, that act definitely makes things impossible that might not have been impossible otherwise. But they haven't foreclosed any possibility that would have been theirs had that intervening event or act not happened.
The intervening act is what?
Just the decision not to have sex. Okay. But that act is definitely ensuring that certain possibilities will not come about. But those possibilities never would have come about anyway, had there, actually, maybe that's not quite going to work out. There's still one.
Here's where I think you're looking at.
Let me just finish. Let's take an actual person. Right? Yeah. Here's my intuition. Let's say there's some good X, right? And someone now does something that absolutely precludes that ever possibly being part of my future. Yeah. But as it turns out, it never would have been part of my future anyway.
Yeah.
I don't feel deprived. I have a sense that that's not deprivation. Right?
Yeah.
Now, had it been something that I would have gotten in the normal course of events and they made it impossible, then I'm deprived, or the act made it impossible. Then I'm deprived. But if it had never been part of my future at all, the fact that now it's guaranteed not to be my future, I don't see if there's any deprivation.
So I feel like I've got a glimmer of what you're after, but I'm not sure I've got it, because the thought you're trying to give voice to is something like, if I only quote unquote deprive you of what never could have been yours anyway, then of course I haven't deprived you. But it's not strictly speaking true to say of these people that I deprive them of what never could have been theirs. It could have been theirs if only we'd had the right kind of sex, right? So what I think you need to be saying instead is something more like this. And again, I'm not quite sure I've got this right, but something like, look, it's more like thinking about it in terms of a deontological moral theory, for those of you who know the jargon, where there's an important difference between doing and allowing. And most of us think it's wrong to kill people, but it's not nearly as objectionable to fail to help people. After all, I can only assume that nobody in this room is a killer, and yet many of you have failed to write checks to Oxfam that would have saved lives, right? And yet you're not feeling as badly about yourself, and we wouldn't feel as badly about you knowing that as we would if we knew you were a killer. So most of us think intuitively it's worse to lower somebody's prospects than it is to fail to augment and increase and enhance their prospects. Armed with that thought, that might help us here, right? Because in the case of these people, at least, and this is where I thought you were going, in the case of these people, not that they couldn't make it, it's that they're not going to be able to make it without my help, or whoever the relevant parents would be. And so failure to bring them about is mere failure to aid. And mere failure to aid intuitively for most of us is not objectionable in the same way that lowering is. Now, that thought would at least explain why this isn't as bad as if I were to kill you. But even if we go with that thought, it's not going to get us all the way towards the views that we wanted, because suppose you're drowning and I could throw you a life preserver and I refuse to do it. Well, I haven't killed you, but for all that we would correctly say, oh my God, look, he died. Isn't that a horrible thing? I could have prevented this bad thing, right? And so there's a case, by virtue of your being actual, where my refusal to aid is a moral objection. Here, intuitively, my refusal to aid is not a moral objection. And so now it's refusal to aid versus refusal to aid. And so these differences about what the possibilities could have been, mightn't have been, so they're not going to cut the ice in the relevant way. All right, I can see that there might be stuff to play with here, but it's not obvious it's going to help.
I wasn't really thinking that way, though. Now I'm starting to think about it. But mainly just thought that there's no entity here that would have a future, right? That I'm lopping off in some way. Just like I'm an existing thing, and what I would have as my future is not going to be affected by an action that precludes.
But when you're drowning, it's not true of you that you would have a future independent of my action. You will only have a future if I act in the relevant way. And that's true of the billions as well. So I think as far as that point goes, they're parallel. And if we're going to find a difference, we're going to have to look elsewhere.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here. There's plenty more to talk about, but let's give.